Hi everybody, and welcome back to Piano Keys Academy. I'm Dr. Michael Finley, back from the dead. That's right, after a long hiatus, I'm finally resurrecting this channel, and I'm thrilled to be bringing you regular content once again. Today we're diving deep into a topic I'm pretty excited about, which is octaves. I must admit, this is something that I always struggled with, which means that it's also something that I've thought a lot about. So without further ado, here are 7 tips that have really helped me. 1. Minimize up and down movement. 2. Minimize in and out movement, and use 4 if it helps. 3. Ricochet and recycle. 4. Grouping. 5. Think of a wide open palm. 6. Don't rush the easy bits. And 7. No Guinness Book. Tip number 1 is to minimize up and down movement. You might have seen some people playing octaves like this with their wrists. They even call them wrist octaves. I've also seen people sort of advocate an up and down movement of the entire forearm. Something like this. Kind of a shaking movement. So either wrist octaves or forearm octaves. So here's my take. Up and down movements are inefficient, and they cause tension and fatigue. Really, any kind of rapid back and forth movement is suboptimal at the piano. First of all, it's just too big a movement to be effective in something like a fast octave passage, and it's actually a form of co-contraction. So what happens is that your extensors are called upon before the flexors have finished their contraction. So we feel it as a co-contraction or opposing muscles pulling at the same time. Your flexors are playing tug of war with their extensors. So everyone try it. Move your hand up and then down, up, down, faster and faster and faster and faster. And I bet you will right away start to notice fatigue both on top and on the bottom of your forearm, and that is because of this co-contraction, because of this tug of war between your flexors and extensors. The same applies with the upper arm. If you're trying to rigidify the upper arm in order to cause your forearm to shake the octaves out. In this case, there's a combination of flexion and extension, and perhaps a little bit of upper arm rotation, internal and external rotation. And so this involves the biceps, triceps, and potentially also the pecs and the rotator cuff all pulling together, which results in a big mess of tension throughout the upper arm and shoulder complex. So you might be able to shake out some really fast octaves by tensing the upper arm and making the forearm tremble, but I'd argue that this is not the healthiest or most controlled approach. So instead, think across. I try to stay as close as possible and feel this as a horizontal movement. There should be a sort of bounciness in the fingertip that sends you from octave to octave, almost like skipping rocks, but mostly you should feel the horizontal movement. I'd like to share an unconventional practice technique I borrowed from my teacher Marc Durand at the University of Montreal. Think of your hand as a wet mop that you're dragging across the keys. So what I'm about to demonstrate will look like terrible technique, but bear with me. So you just kind of mash the keys with your palm like this and trace the outline of the octave passage. So don't worry about sometimes mashing some of the keys in between. The idea is complete floppiness, complete contact with the keys, and just completely ridding yourself of all up and down movement. It's just pure horizontal movement, and we're just tracing the path. If there's any activity at all, it's just in the very tip of the finger. When you go to play it more normally, try to maintain this sense of contact with the key, and I'll bet this will help you feel less vertical and that the octaves will feel easier. So once again, you should feel this sort of horizontal movement and only enough activation in the fingertips to send you from octave to octave. Moving on to tip number 2, which is to minimize in and out movements and to go ahead and use 4 if it helps. When playing white and black keys, it is helpful to maintain as consistent a horizontal plane as possible. So this doesn't just refer to up and down, but also in and out. So this means playing the white keys as close as you can to the black keys as possible to minimize this sort of zigzagging movement. If you use all fives, do your best to play close to the black key area when you play white keys. Going back and forth complicates the movement and gives you a longer distance to travel, impeding speed and efficiency. If you play closer to the black keys, it gives you a much more efficient path for the octave passage. Now it's time for me to give you my spiel about using 4 on black notes, because for me this is a key strategy for minimizing in and out movement. If you have a decent sized hand, I advocate using 4 on the black keys. Now, I realize there's some controversy about this, and that I part ways in particular with the Taubman school of thought on this point. There are a lot of teachers who argue correctly that using 4 on octaves twists the hand towards the pinky. Twisting the hand toward the pinky is a movement that compresses the ulnar nerve and several other structures, and this can indeed lead to wrist pain. So if you feel pain right here, it likely is due to twisting. And if you feel this pain after practicing octaves using lots of 4s or even 3s, that just might be the culprit. This is an injury prevention channel, and I feel some responsibility to give you correct information. So once again, the people who say that using 4 on octaves twists the hand are not wrong. However, I argue that if your hand is large enough, the degree of twisting is modest enough so as not to cause major problems. For my hand, the twisting is on the order of 5 to 10 degrees or so, which is well short of my personal limit of 33 degrees for ulnar deviation, and within what feels like a perfectly healthy range of motion for me. It also helps to play 4 towards the back of the key, towards the fall board. If you play it towards the edge of the key, it creates much more of a twist than if you play at the back of the key. So as you can see from my hand, the twisting is really pretty negligible in this case. Now, let me show you why I think using 4 is beneficial if you have a big enough hand. So let's take the example of the Chopin Etude Opus 25, number 10. Using 4 in this passage is infinitely easier for me than using all 5s, largely because 4 completely eliminates the need to move in and out for each octave. Everything feels like it's right there, and this opening passage feels downright easy to play. If I use all 5s, it's immediately more challenging. I have no doubt that with a bit of practice I could play it well this way, but there's no question in my mind which is easier for me. Now, of course, this all depends on the size of your hand. Many smaller-handed pianists don't have a choice but to use all 5s. And of course, we've all seen small-handed pianists play blindingly fast octaves with all 5s. Same thing goes for people trained in the Taubman approach who swear by all 5s. I've seen it work very well. I'm just sharing what's easier for me personally. And I would argue that large-handed pianists are not necessarily well served by using all 5s, and particularly for chromatic octaves, 4 on black keys can make things feel much easier and minimize the need for in and out movement. This really just highlights the need to adapt your technique to your individual body and your individual hand. We're not all built the same. We might share the same anatomy, but we come in all shapes and sizes. And I just don't think that all 5s fits all hands. Tip number 3 is Ricochet and Recycle. You probably have an easier time playing 2 or 3 octaves in a row than a whole page of them. So one of the keys for getting octaves up to speed is finding a way to passively drop into each octave and actively bounce off the bottom of the key to the next octave. I want to explore the idea of finding a single movement that plays several octaves. Let's look at what I do physically when I play just one single octave. For me, it's a movement from the keys up. I feel a little squeeze from the fingertip coupled with a forward movement from the elbow. And this movement takes me up and out of the keyboard. So let's examine the stages of this movement. So it goes from relatively flat to making a taller and taller hand shape. This is the little squeeze of the fingertip, makes the hand a little bit taller. And then the elbow causes the hand to travel forward, and eventually it lifts the hand out of the piano entirely. So the idea here is to ricochet in such a way that you play an octave at each stage of this movement. So that it feels like all of these repetitions are happening almost inside this one hand movement. So it's one movement that produces multiple octaves. The trick is, once you master this, how do you return to the starting position to start the next group? So I like to think of it as there being a sort of wind up. So there's a shorter group of octaves that you play on your way back to starting position, and then you start the next group. So it's helpful if this wind-up group is on a weak beat, and the first octave of the forward group is on a strong beat. So you might end up making a sort of circle where you play 4 to 6 octaves forward, and then 2 to 3 back, and then you start over. Part of what helps determine the exact number is the meter. So I'm exaggerating the degree of movement here. It's not going to be this large. Actually, it'll feel pretty subtle and internal when working properly. This is how I would approach something like the Erlkönig. So there's a group of 4 that energizes each beat, and then I kind of react on the weak beat in such a way that gets me back to my starting position. And so I really feel like the wind up is the beginning of the group. It's like da 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 da. So what this strategy accomplishes is that it allows us to think in short bursts of octaves rather than be overwhelmed by the whole passage. So this is an excellent segue to the next topic, which is grouping. Tip 4 is grouping, grouping, grouping. Grouping is a really important concept in piano technique, no matter what the challenge, and octaves are no exception. I want to talk about 2 different kinds of grouping that help with octaves. Grouping according to the meter, and grouping according to changes of direction. Grouping according to the meter helps us stay grounded in the pulse and provides a framework for that ricochet and recycle concept we just talked about. It really helps to think of the structural pitches that occur on strung beats as anchor points. So let's take this example from the Liszt Sonata. What's kind of tricky about that passage is that the contour of the passage, that is, the number of notes in the pattern, does not correspond to the meter. So it helps to know where the beats are. So you have a beat here, 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 here. So you can kind of regroup every 4 notes, and it grounds you in the pulse, and once again, it really helps technically because it gives you a framework for that ricochet and recycle concept we just talked about. Grouping according to changes of direction can also be very helpful. Let's take the first few notes of that same passage as an example. You might think that it begins with an up group with 3 notes in it. But actually that top note is the first note of a down group. So the D is where the direction changes. So it helps to think of it this way. 2 notes going up, and then 4 notes going down. So that the D already feels like it's on the way down. So 2 notes, and then down. And then when you get to the D sharp, that's the bottom note of the group. This note sends you back up. And the same thing when you reach the A, that sends you down. The A sharp sends you up. The D sends you down. Up, down, up, down, up, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. So this really helps because I find that a lot of times the stress points of an octave passage are those changes of direction. So it helps to target those points deliberately in your practice. Tip 5 is to think of a wide open palm. Pianist Henry Kramer has a video where he recommends putting your palm on the crown of your head to feel a slight spreading of the palm. This gives you a great hand shape for octaves. There's a certain openness and a certain power you have behind the octave. So even if you have a small hand, it's a healthy way to sort of expand the hand and give you a little bit more span and a little bit more power behind the octave. What I also find is it just ever so slightly firms up the hand position without creating rigidity through tension. So it's not tension, there's just something about this slightly spread position that gives you the firmness that you need to bounce off the bottom of the key. Tip number 6 is not to rush the easy bits. So often some corners of a given passage will be easier than others, which tempts us to try to play the entire passage at the tempo we can play the easiest bits. So don't fall into that trap. Here's a classic example. So to illustrate this point, let's just take the first measure of this passage. So after this first note in the right hand, you have A sharp to B. Black note to white note, just a half step. It really feels like it's right there. You can just slide. So that is relatively easy to execute. And then you have a D sharp, which also feels really nearby. So these three notes are really easy to play fast. However, you have a change of direction, and you have 4 black notes in a row after that. So that is a little less easy. So you might get in trouble if you take this at a faster tempo than you're able to execute the rest of the measure. So it helps not to rush the easy part so that the whole gesture feels equally comfortable. Now, another obvious fact about this particular passage, the first phrase puts the octaves in the right hand and gives you a rests every bar to regroup. The second phrase puts the octaves in the left hand with much larger leaps and no more rests. So if you start the passage at your limit, you might get yourself into trouble halfway through. So take it from me, don't rush the easy bits. Speaking of not rushing, I want to end with this point. Tip number 7 is no Guinness Book. Be patient. Do not force tempo. Do not force speed. Treat an octave passage with the same care you would any other kind of difficulty, which means start slow, increase the tempo gradually, and when you reach your limit, stop advancing the tempo. Call it a day and come back fresh the next day. This is the tricky part, honestly acknowledging our limits. But by acknowledging and accepting our limits, we give ourselves a way to methodically and gradually push them. With consistency, you may gain a click or two on the metronome each practice session, and in time, and with enough patience, I'll bet that you can and will hit your goal tempo. But at any rate, speed is not the goal, music is. It's far more important to play beautifully and well than it is to set the record for fastest octaves. That's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy practicing.